Okay, so hello everyone, welcome. My name is Zoe and my presentation today is all about wounded healers. So I feel very privileged to be presenting again. Memories came up this morning on Google Images about where I was 3 years ago, and that was in Bangkok in person presenting at this conference. So it's lovely to come back. And let's dig into what we're going to be looking at in this session. First of all, a bit of context about me. I am originally from Melbourne, but I spent 5 years living in Southeast Asia, largely divided between Thailand, where I was working as a trauma therapist in an inpatient treatment setting, and also Cambodia, which was the backdrop to my doctoral research in the area of trauma and resilience. And you'll find that during this session, I'll be drawing from some of my experiences, both as a trauma therapist in Thailand, working with international clients, and also my experience in Cambodia in the area of research around trauma. But at the end of 2020, I immigrated to Mauritius, where I'm joining you from today. So greetings from Mauritius. And what areas I'm going to be really drilling into in today's session, to start with the neuroscience of empathy. I'll talk at length about empathy and weave that throughout the session. So we'll start with a bit of a snapshot around neuroscience of it, and then also looking at this fabulous term that I learned in my first year of social work studies, and that is locate yourself in the picture. And so I'll be posing some questions to the group that I would love you to reflect upon. And after the presentation, let's open a dialogue about that, because the question is, are you a wounded healer? So we'll talk more about where that term came from, and also, if we are we more susceptible to compassion fatigue? And I'll talk at the end about some really specific strategies around what we can do to support ourselves during this time, helping others. Okay. This has gone too fast. That's the slide that I want, the neuroscience of empathy, right? So, most psychologists argue that empathy is formed largely between the years of 0 and 2, and this process occurs during nursing. So either the mother, or can be primary carer during nursing, has eye contact with the baby. And during this, the neurons in the mother or primary carer's brain fire at the same time as the baby's brain. And this process is referred to as mirror neurons. So when I say that humans are wired to connect, we really are. And we see that right throughout the course of the lifespan. When you see two people having a close conversation, one is leaning in like this and the other is leaning in like that, essentially mirroring each other's body language, the same process is occurring. And so these mirror neurons are responsible essentially for our socialization and how we then communicate and how we feel. So what sets us aside from many in the animal kingdom as a species is our ability to empathize. So if you tell me something sad, I experience a moment of sadness. Now, I might not experience the same level of sadness, but just for a moment, I have the ability to put myself in your shoes and think how it would feel if I experienced that. So empathy is a very beautiful, natural human response. We can connect to someone else's sadness, pain, despair, loss, grief, but we can also connect to someone's joy, happiness, connection, belonging, and laughter is a really good example of this as well. There might have been times where you've joined some friends or family members and everyone's laughing, and you find yourself laughing even though you missed the punchline or you're not quite sure what's happening. But it's that you see this in groups and even teams in the workplace. You'll find some people will smile and others around them will automatically smile as well. And it is what makes us human. And we're also very apt at being able to respond to someone through this process of empathy and mirror neurons. In my current role, and something that I've done for a number of years, is work with organisations and also leadership teams right across the globe in the area of mental health. And I run lots of communication style workshops. And when I ask people globally, what makes a good leader? What makes a good manager? I hear two things time and time again. It's universal: empathy and active listening. So as humans, some of us are far more empathetic with much more finely tuned active listening skills. And if we have that ability to empathize and actively listen, not only will we build stronger relationships in our personal life, it's very helpful in, regardless of your position at work, building strong relationships in the workplace as well. But let's look at that in terms of a sort of helping others lens. So I had done considerable amount of research before I got into the field in Cambodia. I had been submerged in resilience research from around the world. I knew a huge volume of information around Cambodia, country context, the genocide they had, intergenerational trauma. I could prattle off facts and stats about community violence, gender-based violence. I knew what I was going into from this academic perspective. But when I got there and started to hear stories in a research capacity with amazing, inspiring, incredible young people who had all experienced trauma of being imprisoned in an adult jail, of trafficking, modern day slavery, it started to become very real. It was less on a paper. Mind you, people can still be very affected by what they read and what they see on the media. But for me, what landed with me was slightly different than what I expected to have land. And I use the expression land is more around, sometimes I empathize, I feel that sadness, but I'm able to move away from that and it doesn't stay with me. Whereas there were a few times where I became very affected by the plight of women. And this is where we locate ourselves in the picture. I have what I referred to as a backpack of privilege with me in Cambodia. Being born a white woman in Australia meant that I had access to education and a lot of things that was not the case for women in Cambodia, and not to mention the incredible level of trauma some of them had experienced. And I experienced feelings of anger at the injustices in the world. And I had a huge range of emotions, but this is why it was important for me to locate myself in the picture. Where am I in the context of what I was hearing, what I was reading, and what I was seeing? And for all of you that are listening, and I'm fairly sure I'll be speaking to some wounded healers in this conference, I'm going to come to what that is in just a moment, but we carry our lived experiences with us. And we all have a very different lens on the world based on who we are as a person, our early childhood, our gender, our culture, our background. So we don't look at human suffering in the same way as the next person. And so let's have a look at some examples of Cambodian resilience. And this is what I went into the field looking for. As I mentioned, all of my participants had backgrounds of early childhood trauma. And I have here a story of Cambodian resilience, but I'm going to give you two, because even before this, I couldn't quite figure out which one I wanted to go with. So I'm going to have two. So two young Cambodian men that I met with. As children, they were both trafficked, and they experienced a huge amount of violence and trauma throughout their early childhood. They were supported by NGOs, non-government organisations, and had access to education. both had experienced a lot of behavioral issues around that time. Because they had experienced so much trauma, they were very much in this fight flight way of surviving their environment. They had access to education. One of them taught himself how to read at the age of 14. And they both went on to study, to learn, to grow. And the two young men that I met, one is a psychologist and the other one is a doctor. And these two men, one has got married, has a family of his own. They both work with children that have shared some of the same experiences as them. And one thing that was very prevalent in my research findings with a large number of participants was meaning making. Sometimes in this incredible darkness, humans have a capacity to find light, to construct meaning. What is it that compels us to move forward? What is it that gives us a sense of peace, or we're able to feel calm even after horrible experiences? And one of those areas around meaning that was very prevalent in the two examples that I just shared with you was being able to help others. They spoke of a construction of meaning. They spoke of what was important to them in their life. They spoke of faith. They spoke of connection to others. One said in particular, I wouldn't be who I am today without all that bad stuff happening. And someone has said meaning, purpose, and hope can do miracles. It certainly can. And now let's look at the expression that I chose, which was not my language. It is Jung. He worked alongside Freud, many of you will know, and this is a great expression that I've always loved as a trauma therapist. I'm not what happened to me, I'm what I choose to become. And so Jung was very big on this construction of meaning. He believed that people would go into, back then it was psychotherapy, to treat patients because of their own wounds. Now, this is not just a story of Cambodian wounded healers. There are so many global studies that have been done in this area. For example, there was a huge one in the US where it was over 5,000 social workers participated across multiple states. And in this sample group, almost 50%, so 49% of these social workers had previously diagnosed mental health issues before they started studying social work. There was another study done in the UK about eating disorder experts. They were all clinical psychologists that went on to specialise in eating disorders. Over 30% of them admitted to having their own eating disorder at some point. So when we look at people in the helping professions and what compels them to do what they do, we often find that they themselves have had a history of that. Now, I certainly don't have an early childhood trauma history similar to the people that I spent time with and researched, but I am a wounded healer, as are many, many, many of the therapists that I've met and worked with closely in my life. Because I find that in this profession and in this field, people don't just wake up one morning and think, I'm going to spend 6 to 10 years studying human behavior because I couldn't think of anything better to do. You know, it's more what compels people to go into certain areas is often they are a wounded healer, and it's how they construct meaning. So when you don't need to be a licensed psychotherapist in order to be a wounded healer. What is a wounded healer, or are you a wounded healer? I've found that I've met many wounded healers working in NGOs in various helping capacities. They might not be client-facing, but what has inspired them to work in the area of nutrition programs or child protection is a huge area that I think have a lot of wounded healers, even those that are working not necessarily directly with clients. So when we start to see people that have pursued different occupations, it's often a way that we make sense of what happened, that something traumatic or tragic can compel us to do amazing good. And at this stage, as I mentioned, I've been working with lots of organizations globally, and of course what's happening in Europe at the moment is causing a lot of people huge amounts of distress. And I've spoken to people who have opened their homes to refugees. I've spoken to people who have been raising money and trying to build up their own ways in which we help. And I think that one of the things I love about my work is that I get to see, one, the strength of the human spirit to survive, sometimes against all odds. I find that powerful and compelling. But the other area that I see is these random acts of kindness and people who don't necessarily have to help. It's not their immediate family, or it's not a direct threat, but they still feel compelled to help. I find many of these people fit this category as well. They've had their own traumatic experience or their own experience of grief and loss. So there is some reason, not always, but sometimes a really strong reason why they then put themselves at the coalface of helping others. So it's not all meaning making in this and positivity. Sometimes being a wounded healer means that there can be more of a, sorry, I'm freezing with the air conditioning on here, and might be more linked to compassion fatigue. Why? Because of that process of empathy. Also, some people are just genuinely more empathetic than others. When we look at people who don't experience empathy, people with psychopathology markers and sociopathology, interestingly, global studies have said CEOs have the highest density of psychopathology markers. In my original country of Australia, the number one occupation identified by researchers as having the highest level of psychopathology was actually surgeons. And this is interesting because some of you might think, well, surgeons, are they potentially wounded healers? Are they compelled to treat others and help others? Medical is a little different, and especially according to this one particular research study, because psychopaths, not the Hollywood variety, but they are among us, are often very much driven by status, and they don't have this process of empathy. They can't feel what you feel. It's not possible. And so when we start to look at the variances, one, antisocial spectrum, this is not an issue. Then secondly, other people are slightly less empathetic and slightly more, I would say, have an individualist perspective. Very much this is important to me, and I'm not going to necessarily concern myself with what's happening over here. And then there will be some of you in this group that are highly empathetic and perhaps really sensitive humans. I was talking to a friend not long ago, and I was commenting on how I need to not watch too much of the media, especially at this day and age, whether it's COVID or war that I'm looking at. I find it really distressing, too much media content. And she said to me, how is that possible? You're a trauma therapist. But it's very different. When someone comes to me and I'm working in that capacity as a trauma therapist, I feel like I might be able to help them, and I feel like I might be able to make a difference. Whereas when I'm looking at the media and it can be very global, I have no sense of control over that. Compassion and empathy is activated, but I can't kind of feed that sense of purpose as to what I'm doing. So some of those signs of fatigue and empathy, fatigue and the process of empathy is around recognizing the signs. So for all of you who are thinking, right, that sounds like me, I'm an empathetic, wounded healer, having a look at what are some of those signs. So you can see here this disconnection. Sometimes we detach, disengage, and pull away from key relationships in our life, from the activities that we really enjoy. These are areas that we need to, they're red flags. So if you recognize any of these symptoms on the side, this can be symptoms of burnout, but definitely compassion fatigue. What do we do about it before I sort of open up? I'm happy to have questions and comments. I've seen some great comments coming in through the chat box. So this I've taken from Harvard University. It's actually, they created this model in terms of early childhood trauma and resilience, and they talked about stacking the scales. So in this day and age, when we are bombarded with horrible media images, we're supporting anxious family members, we have tight deadlines at work, we're feeling anxious about global events, we're putting these little pebbles down on these negative outcomes. What we need to do is stack the scale in the other direction. What feeds your soul? Social connectedness, sense of purpose, connection to others, belonging, joy, love, laughter, all of these beautiful human emotions. We need to put pebbles down on the other scale to essentially stack the scales. We don't ignore the negative, but we try to balance this out with the positivity in our life. And just finally, if you like what you've heard, I've written a bunch of articles. You can find me on ResearchGate for lots of Cambodian resilience and recovery from trauma. And there will be one of my publications, I hope, coming out in the conference proceedings as well, specifically about wounded healers and the topic that I've talked about today. So thank you all so much for listening. And do I have any questions?
Thank you so much, Zoe. Yeah, I have a problem with technology today. Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh,
loud
beautiful.
And clear.
Yes, this is the third device that I connect from. Beautiful presentation. Thank you so much. Well, others are thinking about the questions. I would just like to ask. I remember the first speaker, the very first speaker in the very first conference on women's leadership and empowerment many years ago was an acid attack survivor from Cambodia. A woman who, she was taken care of by Australian NGO, and she was trained to do shiatsu massage. And then they opened the Seeing Hands Clinic, if I remember correctly. And now I see there is a chain of those clinics, not only in Cambodia, there is also in Nepal for acid attack survivors, or people who, in Cambodia specifically for acid attack survivors, but in Nepal it's also for people who lost sight for different reasons as well. So, and she was really great, and it was so inspiring to see how, and you must know about those cases in Cambodia, how traumatizing that is, and very few people survive actually. So it was very inspiring. But also what I wanted to ask you, I mean, I see a difference between empathy and compassion. And specifically in Cambodia, for me, it was, although I love Cambodia, and it has changed a lot during the last few years. But for me, it was always so difficult, especially when I go to Phnom Penh. Like the energy is so thick and heavy that you can't even breathe. That's how it feels. Like people don't smile. Like they lost every hope. And then when you go to villages, you see that parents do not get attached to their children as well, because they are used to, they expect that, you know, anytime somebody can come and take their children away and sell them into sex slaves. So how do you protect yourself as an empath from being overwhelmed?
There is a lot of there's a lot of darkness, you're right, in Cambodia, but also globally. Human trafficking and child trafficking is a global concern, and right through European, Asia, African countries, lots of countries experience this. And in amongst this is this incredible strength and resilience of people to survive, and then also to provide for their families. So some of the things that I've seen in Cambodia has been, as the Cambodians would say, touch my heart. It absolutely touched my heart. I've seen people feel compelled to help others to set up their own organizations, and the examples that I gave you of the doctor and the psychologist. And when I see that, that is part of the reason I continue to work in the trauma space, because it is inspiring. It's really inspiring. Sometimes when I watch media reports and I just think, how is it that mankind has come to this? Like, there's so many examples of this globally. But then when you work with survivors who are doing the best that they can, who are demonstrating resilience, and who against all odds are continuing to carve out these beautiful lives with each other, with love and hope and faith for the future. That to me is one of the biggest joys in the work that I do.
Absolutely, thank you. And I'm been so fortunate to meet so many amazing wounded healers across the world who are helping others that are going through the same terrible situations that they once did. So yeah, thank you so much. Are there any questions for Zoe? So sorry for taking so much time. Please feel free to unmute.
I'm looking forward to meeting people afterwards. I might create some polls on the platform, and if anyone wants to ask me a question, you can always message me as well.
Oh, definitely. I look forward to continuing this discussion in the co-op. Thank you so much, Zoe, for this wonderfully insightful presentation, and see you all for the next one.
Certainly will. Thank you.
I'm sorry I was too late in my question. It also wasn't really a question, but what I wanted to say is you picked like also my favorite quote. It's not what I happen to be, but it's what I choose to become. So thank you very much. That's really inspiring for this morning.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. I love that quote too.
It really is. It struck me, and you know, I just read it a few days ago, and then I saw your presentation and said, I gotta watch this. So thank you again very much. It was a great presentation.
Great. Thank you.